All right, welcome to tonight's free prep hour, February 23rd, 2020. My name is Scott Miller. I'm going to be your instructor tonight. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina. And just to start off, a couple of public service announcements. So we do these free prep hours twice a month, and you can attend live. Just go to our Manhattan Prep website and look at the upcoming events, and you'll see where you can sign up for the free prep hour and attend live. We also post these on YouTube, so you have the option to watch the recordings there. We actually have a lot of pretty good free resources on our website. And so you can go to our website, manhattanprep.com/LSAT/resources to see more about our free resources that we have available. You can including sign up for session 1 of any of our LSAT classes for free. You can also try our LSAT interactive on-demand course. So I'm going to, for those of you attending live tonight, I'm going to put a link or some links in the chat window at the end of the session so that you can, check out these resources and go to the website and check out these resources. For those of you who are watching from home, watching on the YouTube recording, if you look at the information for the recording info, the recording details down below the recording if you're looking in a web browser, then you'll be able to see these links too. You'll be able to see the links to the free resources that we have on our website. So for tonight's free LSAT prep hour, we're going to talk about arguments. So arguments are really the backbone of LSAT logical reasoning. We're going to talk in a minute about some statistics, which you may be familiar with, but a large portion of what logical reasoning tests is your ability to understand arguments. And we're going to use questions from the June 2007 LSAT. We use those a lot because the June 2007 test is available for free and has been for a while. It's one of the tests that people are really familiar with and that people have access to, even if you haven't bought a bunch of prep books. So, or even if you don't have access to a bunch of prep materials, you can get a copy of this for free. So, a couple quick facts. I said we're going to mention some quick facts about arguments on logical reasoning and arguments on the LSAT. So basically 80% of all logical reasoning questions require you to understand the components of an argument. 80% of all LR questions are testing to some degree or another in some way, testing your ability to understand what an argument is and how arguments work. And that's 40% of your total LSAT score. 40% of your total score, because again, there are 2 scored LR sections on every LSAT. So if 80% of those questions require you to understand arguments, then 40% of your total LSAT score requires you to understand what an argument is and how arguments work. So let's talk about arguments a little bit. What is an argument? Take a moment and think. Can you think of an example, or can you think of a definition? There's the definition on the screen, right? So an argument is the use of a supporting premise to justify a conclusion. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about what that means. So a conclusion is basically the main point of an argument. And I'm not going to go into this in too much depth. We have other LSAT free prep hours that talk about arguments and where we talk a little more deeply about what an argument actually is and what all these terms actually mean. But basically, we could say that the whole point of an argument is to convince you that the conclusion is true. So the conclusion is basically, we can say, the main point of the argument. And it may be true or false. We don't really know. You never have to accept a conclusion of an argument on the LSAT as true. We actually don't know it's true. The argument is supposed to convince you that the conclusion is true. And the way it does that is by providing some type of evidence or support, by providing one or more premises. So the premises are usually factual. They're usually facts. And so whoever's making the argument is trying to use these facts to convince you then that the conclusion is true. So let's look at an example. Sam hasn't completed any of his homework yet, therefore he won't go to the beach this weekend. Okay, so, facts, we can check with Sam. Hey, Sam, have you done your homework yet? No, Sam hasn't completed any of his homework. And so because of this fact, whoever's making this argument is trying to convince us that because of this fact, because of this premise, Sam won't go to the beach this weekend. May or may not be true. We don't know. It's a prediction, right? This is happening in the future. We don't know if this is true or not. But according to this argument, it is true because of the fact that he hasn't completed any of his homework. Now, you may notice already that this is not a convincing argument. We're going to talk about that in a minute, right? Not all arguments that you see on the LSAT are necessarily convincing. It's not always the case that the premise or premises completely guarantee the conclusion to be true. But in all cases, when you see an argument on the LSAT, that's what the person is trying to accomplish. You know, maybe this is Sam's mom or Sam's roommate or whoever is making this argument. And, you know, whoever's making the argument is trying to convince us that because of this premise, therefore this conclusion must also be true. So that's what we're looking at when we talk about arguments. Every argument, has these components: premise, conclusion. You're always going to see these one or more premises and then some conclusion that we're supposed to believe based on believing these premises. So let's talk about a valid argument. We're going to see a lot of broken arguments. You know, like I said, if you noticed a moment ago that this argument isn't actually very confusing, or sorry, if you noticed a moment ago that this argument isn't very convincing, you're going to see a lot of arguments like that on the LSAT, ones that are not very convincing. So we want to know what a convincing argument looks like, a valid argument looks like. And this, what you see on the screen right now, is a valid argument. So Otis is a dog. All dogs are mammals. Therefore, Otis is a mammal. This is what we call a valid argument. And the way we would describe a valid argument, the way that you know an argument is valid, is we would say that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So, you know, if it is true, if it is in fact true that Otis is a dog, and if it is in fact true that all dogs are mammals, then it must be true that Otis is a mammal. There is no way that the premises could be true and the conclusion could be false. That's what we mean by a valid argument. The premises together connect to completely support the conclusion and guarantee that it is true. But if is a really important word here. If is a really important word. And what I mean by that is we're not concerned about factual truth, right? We're not concerned about factual truth on the LSAT. Like, this might look like a convincing argument. Like, you might be looking at this and going, yeah, that sounds like it could be true, right? Just seems like it could be true, but that's not quite what we're testing. Like, do you actually know any dogs named Otis? Do you? You know, maybe, you know, are there any dogs in the world that are really named Otis? Like, what I'm getting at is, do we know for sure that this premise is actually true? Factually true. Even if it is, even if you know a dog named Otis, does that mean it's the same dog that I'm talking about? You know, do we know that we're talking about the same dog here? So factual truth gets a little weird. Even if an argument looks like it could be factually true, we don't always know for sure if all the premises are factually true. And the good news is you don't have to know that for the LSAT. We don't really care whether things are factually true in real life. That's actually a different concept. That's called soundness, and it's different from validity. Right? So validity is totally hypothetical. With validity, all we care about is if the premises were true. Imagine for a moment that the premises were true. Imagine that this is true, that Otis is a dog. And it actually is true that all dogs are mammals. So if both of these are true, then it must be true that that Otis is a mammal. Right? That's what we mean by a valid argument. There's no way that the conclusion could be false. The way the LSAT will describe this is the LSAT will say the conclusion follows logically from the premises. That's how the LSAT would describe a valid argument, or the LSAT would describe a valid argument by saying the conclusion is properly drawn. All right, so. The reason that, so it's actually a good thing that we don't need to worry about real world truth of these arguments, right? Because, you know, they're going to give you a lot of information in the arguments that you see on the LSAT. And you may or may not know whether the facts that they're presenting are true. But again, you don't have to. You don't have to know that they're true. And just to give you another example of this, let's look at this one. Bob is an elephant. All elephants are pink. Therefore, Bob is pink. Okay. Now, you might be looking at this right away and say, well, wait a minute, all elephants are pink. That's not factually true. It's not factually true that all elephants are pink. But this is still a valid argument because of the if. If it is true that Bob is an elephant, and if it is true that all elephants are pink, then yes, it must be true that Bob is pink. Right? So this is just what I mean by we're not worried, when I say we're not worried about real world truth on the LSAT. We don't have to know whether the premises are true. We don't have to know whether these things are factually true in order to determine whether an argument is valid. Get my words backwards tonight. We don't need to know if the premises are factually true in order to know if an argument is valid. It's just looking at the words that they give you and seeing whether they connect together correctly. All right. So why is this important? Why do we care about this on the LSAT? So it is really important to understand, again, what we mean by a valid argument, because the LSAT's going to give you a lot of broken arguments. And in order for you to understand what to do with a broken argument and why an argument is broken and what the LSAT is asking you about this broken argument, you really want to understand what a valid argument looks like. And to relate this to certain question types, one of the questions that you're going to see in LSAT logical reasoning is an identify the conclusion question. And so this is what the question stem will say. Which of the following most accurately expresses the main conclusion of the economist's argument? Okay, that's an example of a question stem, right? So there's some economist making an argument. You're going to read the argument, and then you're going to find the conclusion. So in this case, again, this is our conclusion. This last statement, Bob is pink, is the conclusion of our elephant argument. So what we would be looking for in an identify the conclusion question is something, an answer choice that basically says Bob is pink, right? It gets a little bit more complicated than that in a real LSAT question. So let's look at a real LSAT question, and I'll give you a moment to look at this. Give everybody a moment to look at this question, and then we'll talk about it. So try this out on your own. See if you can find a correct answer. All right, so let's talk about this. So, one of the things that you're going to need to get used to on the LSAT is, in order to find the conclusion of an argument, you need to be able to read this little paragraph they give you. And in order to make any sense out of the answer choices, you're going to have to find the conclusion. So as we read this, there are some indicators, there are some clues that they give you in here. So we read the first sentence. Every business strives to increase its productivity, for this increases profits for the owners and the likelihood the business will survive. Okay. So that maybe could be an argument. For is sometimes what we call a premise indicator, right? We see the word for, we see because, we see since. We're thinking, okay, whatever follows is a premise. So maybe that's my argument. Every business strives to increase its productivity is the conclusion. For is the premise indicator, and my premise is that this increases profits for the owners and the likelihood the business will survive. But then we have this word but. And but is a really important word in LSAT logical reasoning because it indicates a pivot. It indicates that the argument is very often when you see a word like but or yet or however, it means that we're pivoting from some kind of, one point, like a counterpoint, to the actual argument that's being made, the economist's actual argument. So sometimes these paragraphs start out by describing like the thing that the argument is, the thing that the economist is arguing against. And that's what the first few lines will actually end up being. So be on the lookout for this. Again, we call it an opposing point or a counterpoint. Sometimes the first sentence of this little paragraph will be the thing that the economist is actually arguing against, the thing that the person making the argument is arguing against. And then that word but, yet, however, that pivot word is kind of the giveaway that that's what's happening. So then we see a statement. Not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole. Well, so what is that? Is that the premise or is that the conclusion? Maybe we're not really sure. Often attempts to increase productivity decrease the number of employees. Okay, now that sounds like a reason. That sounds like support. So I'm starting to get the sense here that this is my conclusion. Not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole. And then, and why? Why should I believe that not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole? Well, here's one reason. Attempts to increase productivity decrease the number of employees. And that clearly harms the dismissed employees as well as the sense of security. So these are the reasons why efforts to increase productivity might not be beneficial to the business as a whole. So a couple of things that we're seeing here. We're seeing, understanding the overall structure of LSAT arguments. Being able to notice pivot words like but or yet or however, and recognize that very often what you're going to see in one of these arguments is some type of counterpoint at the beginning, something that the argument is eventually going to disagree with, right? The thing that the argument is intended to dispute. That's the counterpoint. And then we get the pivot word, and then we get the actual argument itself, the conclusion here, and then the premise or premises down here. So what we're most interested in, again, going back to our question, which of the following most accurately expresses the main conclusion of the economist's argument? What we're really interested in is which answer choice matches the most to that middle sentence there. Not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole. And the answer choice that matches this best is answer choice B. Now notice it's not an exact quote. It's rewritten a little bit. Some measures taken by a business to increase productivity fail to be beneficial to the business as a whole. It's not the exact same wording, but it's the same meaning. So when it says most accurately expresses the main conclusion, again, we're looking for the answer choice that has the same meaning, even if the wording is a little different. And what you'll find with these other answer choices is something that's either not exactly the same as the conclusion or, for example, decreasing the number of employees in a business undermines the sense of security of retained employees. So decreasing that's really more in line with the premises. And this is very often what they're going to give you in an incorrect answer like E. They'll give you a premise or the opposing point. They'll give you something that was mentioned in the argument, but it's not actually the conclusion. Other answer choices might go like beyond the bounds of the argument, state something that's not even actually said in the argument, which is really, kind of what some of these other answer choices are doing. So again, identify the conclusion questions. These can be pretty straightforward, and you want to be able to answer these questions, and you want to be able to do this pretty quickly and effectively. What this is really testing, if you're having trouble with these questions, identify the conclusion questions, then you may be having problems with this basic process of understanding what an argument actually is. And what are the pieces of an argument, conclusion and premise? And how do you read this paragraph and actually identify the conclusion and then the premises? How do you actually narrow in and identify that conclusion when they're giving you a bunch of words that and a bunch of sentences that maybe all sound pretty convincing or all sound like claims? And that's where things like just recognizing common structures, opposing point, pivot, conclusion, premise, And, you know, recognizing what these certain keywords mean, like these pivot words, like but, yet, and therefore, or sorry, but, yet, and however. Okay, so let's keep going. I want to cover a little bit more here and dive into some other question types, but that's just a little bit of warm up and you know, an idea about some of the questions or one type of question that you're going to see that's based on your understanding of an argument. Just read, find the conclusion of the argument, and then find the answer choice that clearly identifies or has the same meaning. So I'm going to show you another argument here. Let's take a look at this argument and see if it's a valid argument. All Acme employees who drive to work must park in parking deck A. Lenore is an Acme employee, therefore Lenore must park in parking deck A. Now you might look at this and at first glance it seems like, you know, a fine argument, right? You don't see anything wrong with it. It's going to happen a lot on the LSAT. When they give you an argument, it might actually look like a good argument at first glance. But there's actually something missing here. Does anybody see the thing that's missing? Do these two premises together guarantee that the conclusion is true? If both of these premises are true. Now, like Acme employee, like what is this, a Bugs Bunny cartoon? Yes, that's exactly where I got this. It's exactly where I got this example from, is watching Bugs Bunny cartoons. But who's Lenore, right? Like this is actually all made up. But it looks like it could be factual, but that's not what we care about. We don't care about real world truth. We just care about asking ourselves, if these premises are true, if they're true, if they were true, imagine they are true, would the conclusion also have to be true? And the answer is no. You're maybe seeing what's missing here. Do we know, because there are two parts in this first premise, Acme employees who drive to work. All we know is that Lenore is an Acme employee, so in order to reach this conclusion, we would also have to know that Lenore drives to work. So this premise was missing from my original argument. And this is what you're going to see. So now these three premises together do give us all the information that we need to draw this conclusion. That's another way of describing a valid argument. In a valid argument, the premises give you all of the information that you need to confidently draw the conclusion with 100% certainty. The premises give you all of the information that you need to draw the conclusion with certainty. Other than some things that are considered like, you know, we are expected to know, you know, employee, drive, work, like the meaning of some basic words. But other than that, all the information's there. All right, so how does this relate to logical reasoning on the LSAT? So the LSAT, for the most part, except for certain questions like the identify the conclusion question that we gave you, the LSAT's going to give you a lot of, that we gave you a moment ago, the LSAT's going to give you a lot of broken arguments. So the LSAT is going to give you a lot of broken arguments. What they're going to do is take a perfectly good, valid argument, and they're going to take one of the premises out. They're going to intentionally break the argument. And then so a large portion of LSAT logical reasoning questions fall into what we call the assumption family. The assumption family questions are all based on arguments and based on an argument that's missing a premise or one or more premises, right? It might be missing several premises. The argument's broken, it's missing several pieces that we actually need to know in order to actually draw the conclusion. So we would call that missing piece, Lenore drives to work. We would call that missing piece an assumption. So anytime there's a broken argument, anytime an argument doesn't contain, the premises don't contain all the information that you need to draw the conclusion, we're going to say that the argument is assuming something, the argument, there's an assumption being made in the argument, and a large number of questions in LR are going to be asking you something that involves that assumption, something to do with the assumption. That's why we call them the assumption family. So one type of question is sufficient assumption question. Sufficient assumption question, this is the wording that you'll see in the question stem. The argument's conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed. So one of the following is, the following is the answer choices. if we assume one of the answer choices, if you know, we assume one of the thing that's stated in one of these answer choices, if we assume that, then we get a valid argument. The conclusion does follow logically. Okay, so this question, sufficient assumption question, this kind of question stem is asking you, find the missing premise, find the thing that will allow these premises to guarantee the conclusion, the thing we can add back into the argument that would allow the premises to support the conclusion. So again, a correct answer, if this was my argument, would be Lenore drives to work. So let's see how this looks in a real LSAT, question, a real sufficient assumption question. So I'm going to show you the question, and you know what you're going to have to do in order to answer this question correctly is you're going to have to understand the argument that they give you. You're going to have to understand the broken argument that they give you. You're going to have to find the conclusion in the little paragraph that they give you. They're not going to lay it out all nice and neat like I have this one here on the screen. You're going to have to read that paragraph and figure out what the conclusion is. And then you're going to have to figure out what the premises are. And once you have that information, then you can spot the missing premise. But this is something I tell people all the time. This is something a lot of students struggle with. A lot of students struggle with a lot of questions in logical reasoning, like these sufficient assumption questions, because they don't take the time to get a clear understanding of the argument that you're given, the broken argument that they're given. A lot of people will just quickly read the little paragraph at the top and then try to figure it out kind of by intuition or by what makes sense to them. And that's either it's not going to work well in all cases. You might get some questions right that way and others you're not going to. Or you might just, it might take you much longer than it should to arrive at a correct answer. So it's one of the things I want you to notice tonight that's that's going to be an ongoing theme in our discussion tonight, is how really understanding what an argument is and being able to identify the pieces of an argument that they've given you, to be able to understand all that, is going to be the key to successfully answering, you know, a large number of these questions in logical reasoning. So that's going to be that's my hint for this next question when you see it, is make sure that when you read the little paragraph, the stimulus they give you at the top, make sure you clearly identify what the argument is before you ever look at the answer choices, before you ever take a look at the answer choices. So here's the question. All right, that was around 1 minute and 20 seconds. So we use 1 minute and 20 seconds a lot because that's on average, if you were to take the normal number of questions in an LR section and divide it by 35 minutes, which is normally the amount of time you have, comes out to about 1 minute and 20 seconds per question. So that's always a good goal to shoot for. Okay, so again, this is what we call a sufficient assumption question. The argument's conclusion follows logically. The conclusion follows logically if We get a valid argument if which one of the following is assumed. And again, before we even worry about the answer choices, we need to go up and we need to read the argument that they're giving us and figure out what the premises are and what the conclusion is and what's wrong with it. What is wrong with this argument that they're giving us? So we start reading the little paragraph. We start reading this argument they're giving us. Undergraduate degree is necessary for appointment to the executive board. Okay, I don't know what that is. Is that a premise? Is it a conclusion? I don't know. Further, no one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board. Okay, this is starting to sound kind of factual. I'm starting to suspect maybe that these are premises. These are facts that they're giving me to build some kind of an argument. And then I read this next sentence. Thus, Murray, an accountant with a bachelor's and a master's degree, cannot be accepted to the position of an executive administrator since he has a felony conviction. Okay, so thus is a conclusion indicator. And you want to get used to certain words on the LSAT that indicate that you are about to read a conclusion. So words like therefore, we've been using that in our examples. Thus means the same thing. So means the same thing. Hence, you want to notice these words when you see them, because what they tell you, they actually tell you two things. They tell you that what comes after is a conclusion and what comes before is the premise. So based on the thing that came before, I want you to believe this conclusion. There are several other keywords too, several other conclusion indicators too. There are also premise indicators and then pivot indicators that we talked about a little while ago. You want to be familiar with all these, right? What are the words on the LSAT and logical reasoning that indicate you're about to read a conclusion? What are the words that indicate you're about to read a premise? What are the words that indicate you're about to see a pivot from some kind of background information or opposing point to the actual argument? So thus is a word that indicates a conclusion. So that's telling me that the rest of this is probably my conclusion. Okay. So, and then what came before are my premises. What are the premises? The premises are that an undergraduate degree is necessary. Undergraduate degree, need my pointer working here. Undergraduate degree is necessary for appointment to the executive board, and no one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board. Okay. Now, sometimes the LSAT will make things a little more complicated, because if you read that conclusion again, that last sentence, there's actually a fact in there. The conclusion is, that Murray cannot be accepted to the position of executive administrator. But there are actually some facts in here too, some additional facts that they're giving us about Murray. So what do we know about Murray? We know that Murray is an accountant so we know an undergraduate degree is necessary for an appointment to the executive board. So we know that Murray has both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. Okay, so he meets that requirement. But then we're also told some additional information. He has a felony conviction. Since, the word since is an indicator of a premise. When you see the word since, it means what you're about to read after that is a premise. And there are actually several words we see on the LSAT that indicate you're about to read a premise. We want to look at words like since, for, and because. Those are all words that indicate, or after all. Even for example. All these words and phrases tell you that you're about to see a premise, that whatever immediately follows, almost always. The LSAT test writers are good at making exceptions. They're good at throwing curveballs at you, but almost always when you see one of these words, whatever follows is a premise. So I do have a conclusion in here. There definitely is a conclusion in here. My conclusion is that Murray cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator. But these other statements about Murray are my facts. He has a bachelor's degree and he has a felony conviction. Okay, so what is the problem with this argument? right? What's wrong with this argument? So an undergraduate degree is necessary for appointment to the executive board, but no one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board. Okay, well, Murray has a felony conviction, so he cannot not be accepted for the position of executive administrator. At first glance, this might sound pretty good, right? But notice that there is actually a significant problem with this argument, which is that we've shifted. We've made a shift. We've made a shift from executive board. My premise is talking about what is necessary to be on the executive board. Does anybody notice the shift in the conclusion? Conclusion is talking about executive administrator. So now, are those that are those the same thing? Is the executive administrator a appointment on the executive board? So, you know, there are some things that we're expected to know on the LSAT that are common knowledge. But this isn't necessarily one of them. Like, I don't know that a position on the executive board or the executive administrator is a position on the executive board. So that's the gap in the argument. The gap is going from premises that tell me about being appointed to the executive board to a conclusion about Murray becoming the executive administrator. We don't know. This argument hasn't given us enough information about the executive administrator to know that that's actually a position on the executive board. Maybe it's like some other position in some other department or something, right? So with that information in mind, I'm going to look at my answer choices. And when we look at answer choices, we want to go through them one at a time and try to get rid of answer choices that we know are wrong. Anyone with a master's degree and without a felony conviction is eligible for appointment to the executive board. So does that really help us know that Murray won't be appointed to the board? It kind of makes it, well, it says anyone with a master's degree and without a felony conviction is eligible for appointment. But we already know that if you have a felony conviction, no one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board. And again, this is all about the executive board. This isn't telling us, this answer choice doesn't tell us anything about how the executive board connects to the executive administrator. So we're not really interested in that. Only candidates eligible for appointment to the executive board can be accepted for the position of executive administrator. Now, I really like that answer choice because it does what I'm looking for. It connects the idea in the conclusion, executive administrator, with the information that we're given, the different information that we're given in the premises. Appointment to the executive board. So in a sufficient assumption question, just like Lenore drives to work, this is the piece of information that we need. You have to be eligible for the executive board in order to be accepted for the position of executive administrator. We know that based on this information, Murray isn't eligible for the executive board. So if we, basically the way this works is for a sufficient assumption question, the correct answer is a missing premise. If we were to take this answer choice B and plug it back into the argument as a premise, we would have a valid argument. That's what the correct answer should do. So I'm not going to go through the other answer choices just because I want to cover some other question types tonight. But basically what we would do, if I was doing this in real time on an actual LSAT, I would eliminate A. I wouldn't select B right away, because I want to make sure that there aren't any other answer choices that somehow connect executive board with executive administrator. If there are, I might have to see which one goes in the right direction. So in other words, I might have an answer choice that says, I might have an answer choice that says only candidates eligible something like this. So I might have another answer choice that talks about a connection between executive administrator and the executive board. Maybe, answer choice D does this. So I wouldn't want to pick the first answer that I see just because it looks right. Even if you're pretty sure that it's right, I always want to look at the remaining answer choices and be on the lookout for another answer choice that looks really similar. If this is the only answer choice that connects being on the executive board with being accepted for the position of executive administrator, then we're good. But if I have two that seem to do the same thing, then I need to look more closely and see which one is actually going in the direction that I want. This says only candidates who are eligible for the appointment of the position of executive administrator. Who's that? Who's that talking about? Is it talking about Murray? We don't know whether or not. So remember, our conclusion is saying that Murray cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator. So we don't know if that's true or not. We don't know if apparently it seems like the information we're given says that Murray is not eligible for appointment to the executive administrator. So, this doesn't really go in the direction we want. This doesn't tell us that something in the premise is connected to something in the conclusion. This is a reversal of what we want, which is a really common trap answer that you're going to see in sufficient assumption questions. So a lot of the times, if you're lucky on an easier version of the question, there's only one answer choice that's connecting the two ideas that we want. Executive board with executive administrator. On an easier version of a sufficient assumption question, there's only one answer choice that does that. If there's more than one answer choice that makes that connection, we need to look closely to see which one is actually going in the right direction, doing the work that we need, making the connection that we need. All right, so let's keep going. Let's talk about necessary assumption questions. So again, with a sufficient assumption question, we're looking for something that, a premise that we can plug into the argument and create a valid argument. That's what a sufficient assumption does. A necessary assumption is doing something different. So this is the type of question stem you'll see in a necessary assumption question. The argument depends on assuming that. So the difference here is you'll see wording, language in the question stem that deals with dependency, necessity. That's why we call these necessary assumption question. So it's asking us about an assumption, but it's asking for us for an assumption that the argument depends on. Sometimes it'll ask for an assumption that the argument requires, or it'll just say that is necessary. Which of the following is an assumption that is necessary? So when you see any of this language of necessity, what this is saying is you're not looking to make the argument valid. You're not looking for something that guarantees the conclusion based on the premises. This is how it's different. Sufficient assumption, you're looking for something that guarantees the conclusion. Necessary assumption, the best way to think of a necessary assumption is you're looking for an assumption that defends the argument against a possible objection. So what does that mean and how does that work? Necessary assumption defends the argument against a possible objection. So can you think of a possible objection in this argument? Remember, the thing that's missing from the argument, the piece that's missing from this argument is that Lenore drives to work. I didn't give you that yet. If we're just looking at the argument as it exists over here, we don't know that Lenore drives to work. So because of that, there are a lot of possible objections because we don't know this. We're going to stick this fact up over here because we don't know whether that's true or not based just on the argument that you're given. So because this argument has a gap, because this is a broken argument, you can come up with a whole bunch of possible objections that would ruin this argument or that would cast serious doubt on the argument. You can come up with a whole, what an objection would do is basically weaken the argument. Sometimes we call these weakeners. So I'll give you an example of an objection. What if, well, you know, a good objection might start with what if. What if Lenore is too young to drive? What if Lenore is too young to drive? Well, that's going to ruin our argument, isn't it? Because in order for this argument to work, we have to assume that Lenore drives to work. If she's too young to drive, then this argument falls apart. Yeah, she's an Acme employee, but, you know, mom drives her to work or she takes the bus or whatever, right? So we don't know that she drives to work. We don't know that she has to park in the parking deck. So you notice this is kind of weird, right? This is coming out of left field. You might be saying, what do you mean drives to, you know, too young to drive? But because this is an objection that would actually hurt the argument, what that means is we have to assume, it is necessary to assume that Lenore is not too young to drive. So this is what necessary assumptions do. This would be a correct answer to a necessary assumption question. If the question asks you, the argument depends on assuming that, and answer choice A, let's say, answer choice A was Lenore is not too young to drive, that's going to be a correct answer. Why? Because if Lenore is too young to drive, that ruins the argument. This argument has no chance of ever being valid. These premises have no chance of guaranteeing this conclusion if Lenore is too young to drive. So in order for the argument to have any chance of being valid, it is necessary to assume that Lenore is not too young to drive. That's all we're looking for in a necessary assumption. We're not, you know, just because Lenore isn't too young to drive, does that mean that she, you know, okay, if this is true, if A is true, does that mean we have a valid argument? No, because there are a whole bunch of other possible objections that we have to defend against, right? Maybe Lenore is old enough to drive, but she's blind. Maybe she can't drive because she's blind, or some other reason why she cannot drive a car, some physical condition that prevents her from driving a car. So there are a whole bunch of other possible objections that answer choice A does not defend against, but that's okay, because we're not trying to prove anything. We're just trying to defend the argument against one objection. It is necessary to defend the argument against this objection, so it's necessary to assume that Lenore is not too young to drive. So let's look at an actual necessary assumption question, an actual LSAT question, to see how this works. So again, take a look at this. I'm going to give you about 1 minute and 20 seconds to work on this. See if you can come up with the correct answer, and we'll talk about it. All right, that was 1 minute and 20 seconds. So let's talk about this one. The argument depends on assuming that necessary assumption question. So what is the argument? So, you know, and again, the one thing I want to emphasize here is anytime a question talks about an argument, you need to read the stimulus and understand what the actual argument is. What is the conclusion and what are the premises? That's a big theme here. And an important thing to always remember when you're approaching these questions. If you don't have a clear picture what the conclusion is and what the premises are, then you're going to really struggle. So, feathers recently taken from seabirds stuffed and preserved in the 1800s have been found to contain only half as much mercury as feathers recently taken from living birds of the same species. Okay, so we're comparing birds from the stuffed birds from the 1800s to living birds. And we're saying that there's a difference in the mercury. Now that sounds factual, right? That sounds pretty factual. It doesn't sound like a claim. It doesn't sound like something you have to convince me of. It sounds like a fact, evidence. Sense. So what do we expect to see after the word sense? I mentioned it a moment ago, a little bit earlier. Are we expecting to see a premise or a conclusion after sense? Sense is a premise indicator. It's like because. Here's why, right? So we know that this is a premise. Mercury that accumulates in a seabird's feathers as the feathers grow is derived from the fish eaten by the bird. Now, notice we have, so you might think, okay, well, the rest of this whole thing is a premise. Where's the conclusion? But we have a really common structure here that you're going to see again and again on the LSAT. We have this, a premise indicator, sense, and then we have a statement, and then we have a comma. And this comma is really, really important right here because it tells you that there's a divide, two different statements in this sentence. The first statement is, in fact, our premise. So our premise is everything that I just boxed in a moment ago. Mercury that accumulates in the seabird's feathers as the feathers grow is derived from fish eaten by the bird. But that comma tells us that there's a break there, and then what follows is the conclusion. So our conclusion is these results, the results we mentioned up earlier, indicate that mercury levels in saltwater fish are higher now than they were 100 years ago. What are the results? The results are up here. So the results is that's going to be one of our premises. In this case, because the conclusion is referring back to some results, so we need to take the results into consideration as part of our evidence. And what the conclusion is saying is that these results that we see here indicate that the mercury levels in the saltwater fish are higher now than they were 100 years ago. Okay, so there's my argument. Mercury that accumulates in the seabird's feathers as the feathers grow is derived from the fish eaten by the bird. So the feathers taken from seabirds that are alive today have more mercury than the ones from the 1800s. The birds, the stuffed birds from the 1800s. The stuffed birds from the 1800s have only half as much mercury. So mercury levels in saltwater fish now, the fish that the birds eat must be higher. Sounds like a good argument, right? This all sounds pretty good. And a lot of LSAT argument, if I'll say this, maybe you're already seeing a problem with this argument, but if this argument sounds good to you, you're not alone, because a lot of these arguments sound pretty convincing. So we have to think, okay, well, what are we not being told here? A lot of LSAT logical reasoning questions are about really they're testing your understanding of alternatives and being able to see alternatives. So you read this argument and you say, okay, well, what's an alternative explanation other than the mercury levels in the fish that the birds eat? So notice that we're comparing, in our premises, we're comparing two different types of birds. We're comparing stuffed and preserved birds from the 1800s with living birds of the same species. So we know they're the same species. It's not like a difference between the species, but there seems to be a difference here between birds stuffed and preserved in the 1800s and living birds. So what are some possibilities? Maybe mercury, other than it's coming from the fish. Well, maybe the mercury breaks down over time, right? Birds from the 1800s, maybe somehow the mercury leaves the birds' bodies once they're stuffed. So the birds from the 1800s had just as much mercury in them from the fish. It was the same amount of mercury coming from the fish, but the mercury somehow broke down. Like that would be one possible objection. So we would have to assume, it is necessary to assume that the mercury did not leave the stuffed birds' bodies, or, I guess feathers, over time. Now, this isn't a science question, right? So this would be a correct answer. we have to assume that the mercury did not leave the stuffed bird's feathers over time. Because if mercury did leave the stuffed bird's feathers over time, then that's an alternate explanation, and it might not be true that the mercury levels in the saltwater fish are higher now than they were 100 years ago. This isn't a science question. That's one of the most important things to realize about this, because a lot of people will look at this and say, oh, I don't know about mercury. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if mercury, whether mercury leaves stuffed birds' feathers or not. Like, I'm not a taxidermist. I'm not a biology major. I don't know how this works. You don't have to. And that's one of the really important things I tell people all the time. This isn't a science test. This isn't a biology test. You're not being tested on what you know about mercury or birds or stuffed birds or fish. This is testing your ability to read this paragraph and notice the details in the information that you're given. Without even fully understanding the details, you just notice we're talking about stuffed and preserved birds versus living birds. Birds in the 1800s versus birds today. And the conclusion is kind of ignoring that difference. Right? The conclusion is only focusing on the fish. If you just notice those details without worrying about the fact that this is science and birds and mercury and all that stuff, just notice there's a difference in the details. There are some really significant details in the premises that are being ignored by the conclusion. If you notice that, then that's enough to see what is wrong with the argument. So as we go through the answer choices here, I'm just going to cut to the chase. I know we're starting to get towards the end of our session here, so I'm going to show you which of the answer choices is correct, and that is answer choice E. The process used to preserve birds in the 1800s did not substantially decrease the amount of mercury in the bird's feathers. Why? Because if the process that was used to preserve the birds in the 1800s did substantially increase the amount of mercury in the bird's feathers, then we don't know for sure that this conclusion is true based on the premises that were given. If this isn't true, if answer choice E is not true, then that would cause a serious problem for the argument if this is not true. So therefore, it is necessary to assume that answer choice E is true. And again, if you look at other answer choices, like these aren't things that we have to know. You know, mercury derived from fish is essential for the normal growth of the seabird's feathers. Like that might appeal to be an appealing answer choice if you're kind of confused about things like, oh, I'm really confused about, you know, the science in here. You get all wrapped up in the science. Like, is this explaining why it has to be the fish? Why the fish have to be the explanation for the difference in mercury levels? It's not really explaining why it has to be the fish. It's just saying that the fish do something important, but it's not addressing the difference between the mercury levels years ago versus today. So you are going to find some answer choices that, you know, bring in some outside information. That's not necessarily bad. It's not necessarily bad that this is talking about what's essential for the normal growth of the seabird's feathers. The thing that makes answer choice C wrong is it's not necessary to assume anything about what makes the feathers grow normally, not for this argument. E is also bringing in some outside information, right? It's talking about the process used to preserve the birds, the process used to preserve the birds, right? And that process decreasing the amount of mercury. And you might look at that and say, well, the argument doesn't say anything about the process used to stuff the birds. That's okay, it doesn't have to. But we do have to assume this thing about that process in order for the argument to work. So with necessary assumption questions, one of the things that trips people up about necessary assumption questions is the correct answers often do bring in outside information. And that's okay in a necessary assumption question. Just like if we go back to Lenore and her driving, again, you know, it is necessary to assume that Lenore is not too young to drive. And again, you know, the argument never said anything about her age, right? Like the mistake that a lot of people make with necessary assumption questions is they would eliminate an answer choice like this because they would say, oh, the argument never said anything about Lenore's age. It doesn't have to. The whole point of a necessary assumption question is that the correct answer is defending against something that the argument never thought of, that the argument never considered, a possible objection that the argument never considered. So it's okay, you know, and there are almost an infinite number of possible objections. When you leave a big hole in the argument, that opens the argument up to all kinds of objections. So it's okay if an answer choice to a necessary assumption question brings in some new information. The question is that new information relevant to the argument? Does this answer choice help defend the argument against something that would possibly hurt it? So, you know, we've looked at two common question types, necessary assumption and sufficient assumption. And these are question types that people struggle with. And hopefully, especially looking at what actually a necessary assumption does, because that's the thing a lot of people struggle with often, is not understanding what a necessary assumption actually does, how a necessary assumption is different from a sufficient assumption. And people get really caught up with necessary assumptions because they see the answer choices bringing in new information and they think that's bad. And it's not. So let's quickly look at, and one of the points I'm trying to make here is in the similarities between a lot of the different questions that you're going to see in the assumption family. Sufficient assumption, necessary assumption, flaw, strengthen, and weaken. These questions are really similar in a lot of ways, and the way they're similar is that they're all presenting an argument with some kind of gap in it, with a missing premise. So in all these types of questions that we're looking at right now, except for the identify, well, even in the identify a conclusion, right? Identify the conclusion, you're still looking for the argument. And then these other questions that we've just talked about, sufficient assumption, necessary assumption, and then the next few we're going to look at quickly, flaw, strengthen, and weaken. With all these questions, sufficient assumption, necessary assumption, flaw, strengthen, and weaken, they're giving you a broken argument. They're giving you an argument with a piece missing. That's why we can use the same sample argument to talk about all these different types of questions. So a flaw question is going to say something like, the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on which of the following objections? Okay, so what this is telling you is that the answer choices are possible objections to the argument. So again, what are some objections? Maybe here would be a correct answer. Lenore might be too young to drive. Another possible objection, another possible correct answer would be Lenore might have a condition, a physical condition that prevents her from driving. You know, and that list goes on, right? What are some reasons that would make us question whether or not Lenore drives to work? So these are all possible objections. You know, maybe C, Lenore always takes the bus to work because I don't know, you know, she hates to drive. So any of these are possible objections that would hurt the argument. So these are all things, and another way that the LSAT will mention these, another way that the LSAT might do this, is they might say something like, the argument is most vulnerable to criticism. The argument is most vulnerable to criticism. Another way they would say this, I'm trying to make sure I say this in a very LSAT-like way. Something like the argument is most vulnerable to criticism. Or we say vulnerable to which of the following criticisms? So if they word it this way, the argument is most vulnerable to which of the following criticisms? Now they've left themselves a little more open, right? Because now they could give you an objection or they could give you an assumption. They could give you either one in the answer choice. So we could say the argument assumes or we maybe just say it assumes that Lenore drives to work. Or this would also be a correct answer. It assumes that Lenore is old enough to drive. So basically, anything that's necessary to assume in order for this argument to work would be a reason why the argument is vulnerable to criticism. The argument is vulnerable to criticism because we have to assume one of these things, right? But they could also reword these as objections. So it fails to consider that Lenore might be too young to drive. So now when we switch this around and we say it fails to consider, now we're talking about something that the argument has not defended itself against already, right? A possible objection. So fails to consider, Lenore might be too young to drive. Why is that a problem? Because if Lenore is too young to drive, then this argument no longer makes sense. So and it might, another way that they make these answer choices difficult is they word them in a very abstract way. So they might say something like, it presumes, without providing justification, that one possible mode of transportation is the only mode that Lenore uses. Or something like, you know, that maybe a little better way would be just because one possible mode of transportation can be used, Lenore does use that form of transportation. Like, they can get into really abstract ways of wording these answer choices. What is this actually saying? It assumes, the argument assumes that just because one possible mode of transportation can be used, that just because a person can drive a car, that Lenore does use that form of transportation, that Lenore does drive a car, right? Presumes without providing a justification that Lenore uses a certain form of transportation when other forms may be available to her, right? So notice it doesn't necessarily say anything specifically about cars, but this is describing in a very abstract way the idea that this argument is assuming that Lenore drives to work, right? So, you know, what you have to be able to do in these cases is look at these really abstractly worded answer choices and see if you can actually relate them to something that is being assumed or something in the argument. Because, you know, very often with the answer choices, with the incorrect answer choices, you won't be able to in any way. They're going to be worded really abstractly, but you can't even relate them to anything that's being said in the argument or anything that's being assumed. So just want to look at two more types really quick, and then we'll call it a night. But again, just to continue with this idea that all of these, what we call the assumption family questions. So sufficient assumption, necessary assumption, flaw, strengthen, and weaken. The basic foundation for them is all the same. They're giving you an argument with a missing premise. They're giving you an argument with a gap in it, with a problem in it. So when you go and read the question and you recognize that it's one of these types of questions, again, they're saying right here, there's an argument. You need to go find the argument in the little paragraph they give you in the stimulus. So if we talk about strengthening the argument, the thing about strengthening is it just says strengthen. So we're not trying to prove anything. We don't have to guarantee that the argument is valid. In other words, We don't have to guarantee that Lenore drives to work. All we have to do, all a correct answer to a strengthened question has to do is make it a little bit more likely. So I'll give you an example. Here's a correct answer. Lenore knows how to drive. That would strengthen the argument. Doesn't mean she does drive to work, but it makes it more likely that the assumption, remember our assumption hanging out up here, the thing that wasn't stated in the argument, Lenore drives to work. Is that really the case? We don't know. We weren't told that in the argument, but this makes it a little more likely that that's true. So for a strengthened question, this is what a big thing to remember. A, it says, which of the following, if true? So nothing in here tells us that Lenore knows how to drive, right? Nothing in our original argument tells us that Lenore knows how to drive, but it doesn't need to. We don't need any evidence over here that the answer choice is true. It's if it is true, what impact does it have on the argument? And that makes the argument more likely to be valid because it strengthens the assumption. If we say B, Lenore, I don't know, Lenore does not like to take the bus. Does this prove anything? No. But if Lenore doesn't like to take the bus, it makes it a little bit more likely that she does drive to work. So again, the big thing with strengthened questions is it's okay if it brings in outside information. Totally something from left field. Taking the bus, what does the argument have to do with taking the bus? It would be really easy to eliminate an answer choice like B if you think that B is wrong because the original argument doesn't mention taking the bus. That's not the question we're asking, though. The question we're asking is, if this is true, what effect does it have on the argument? Does it strengthen the argument? Yes, because if it's true, it makes it at least a little bit more likely. We don't know for sure, but it could make it a little bit more likely that Lenore drives to work. And if none of the answer choices, other answer choices, make this any more likely, then B would be the correct answer. What you're often going to see in a strengthened question, this is where the LSAT gets a little trickier, is you might actually get a situation like this in a strengthened question because it says most strengthens the argument. And this is where strengthened questions can get a little tricky. It says most strengthens the argument. So now if we were looking at both, up until now, I've been giving you multiple examples of correct answers, and you would never see more than one. In the previous examples I've given you, like with the flaw and necessary assumption, you'd never see more than one correct answer. You're not going to see more than one correct answer generally. With strengthened questions, though, that's where we can get into where it says most strengthens the argument. Now we can get into a possibility where there might be two answers that both seem to strengthen. So now how do we decide between them? So now you do have to decide which one does the most. And like in this case, I would say A is probably the better answer. It does more to convince us that Lenore drives to work. Just the fact that she doesn't like to take the bus, well, maybe she, takes a bicycle. Maybe she, takes the, I don't know, takes the train. Who knows? Maybe she walks to work, right? Maybe she works from home. No, actually. Well, I don't know. Let's not go there. But do you see the idea, right? Where it says most strengthens, be on the lookout in harder versions of strengthened questions for cases where you actually do have to decide between two appealing answers. And generally, whichever answer you have to add more to in order to make it relevant is the one that we're not as interested in. The answer choice that we have to add fewer assumptions to, we have to add less information of our own to, is more likely to be correct. So then the last type of question that we would look at, and then we'll just call it a night for here. The last type of question we would look at is weakening the argument. And weakening is basically the opposite of strengthening, right? So if we say, which of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the argument? And again, we have the most there, right? So again, either of these, A or B, if we change them up a little bit, could be a good answer to a weakening question. So we could weaken the argument by saying what? How would we change A to make it weaken the argument? We could change A to make it weaken by saying Lenore does not know how to drive. That would definitely weaken the argument. That would cast a lot of doubt on the argument. In fact, that would, maybe pretty seriously destroy the argument, right? That would be maybe a little bit more obvious than what you would see in a weakened question. But if we said Lenore likes to take the bus, does that weaken? Yeah. So, again, an answer choice to a weakened question can bring in something totally out of left field. The bus, where does the bus take, where does that come from? But what happens if it's true? What happens if Lenore really does like to take the bus? It makes it a little bit less likely that she drives to work, which weakens our argument. And again, it's really comparing this to the other answer choices. You would have to see this. You might be saying, yeah, but that doesn't weaken the argument very much. But that's okay. If none of the other answer choices really weaken it at all, then all we're looking for is the answer choice. All an answer choice has to do is weaken it a little bit in order to be the correct answer. If none of the other answer choices, like, all the other answer choices are kind of, Lenore's car is blue. Does that mean she drives it to work? Like, I don't know, right? Does that tell me whether she drives it? No, it just tells me the car is blue. The parking deck is free. That kind of seems to strengthen the argument, doesn't it? So you might see answer choices that really don't have much impact on the argument at all. You might see answer choices that strengthen the argument. Again, that doesn't guarantee that she drives to work, but it's free. It maybe makes it a little more likely that she does, but we're not looking to strengthen, we're looking to weaken. So this is generally what you might see, is a bunch of answer choices that, when you look at them closely, either don't really do much to the argument at all, or if anything, they do the wrong thing. They strengthen. They seem to strengthen if they're relevant at all. And one of the answer choices, which might be hard to spot, actually does weaken it a little bit. All right, folks, so that's a whirlwind tour of the assumption family in logical reasoning. And this group of questions that we're going to see that all involve arguments. And the assumption family specifically are ones that involve broken arguments, an argument where the LSAT has taken a perfectly good, valid argument and removed one of the premises, which means there is a gap in the argument. The argument is flawed. You have to make assumptions in order for the argument to hold up and be valid. And these different types of questions are just asking you different things that are all related to that assumption, that missing piece of the argument. So think about think about how these arguments, how these question types are similar, and how does that inform your approach? And I'll say the one thing that was similar in all these questions that we looked at is they all talked about an argument in the question stem. So when these questions talk about an argument or a conclusion or reasoning, or they just talk about an assumption, then whenever you see this language, argument, conclusion, reasoning, assumption, sometimes in the science questions, it'll say something like hypothesis. When you see this language, it means there's an argument here. There's some kind of conclusion or claim that's being supported by evidence. And for any of these questions, you need to be able to look at the paragraph they give you and clearly identify what are the premises and what is the conclusion. If you don't feel like you're good at that, that's a really good place to focus your LSAT studies, is get better at reading a paragraph and being able to identify what is the conclusion and what are the premises. Clearly identify that, because you really need to do that, especially the more complicated the arguments get. You need to do that in order to be able to clearly see what the gap is. What is the gap in the argument, the thing that they left out? And as you can see, all these questions that we've talked about tonight, sufficient assumption, necessary assumption, they're all, strengthen, weaken, flaw, they're all dealing with that gap in the argument. And so, you need to be able to spot that. All right, so last thing I'm going to say, just a few more notes before we call it a night. First of all, thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. Think about some takeaways. For you personally, based on what we talked about tonight, what do you personally want to remember and practice? You know, next time I see what, I will do what. Next time I see a question in LR that mentions an argument, I will make sure I understand what the argument is, understand what the premises are, and understand what the conclusion is. Next time I see a necessary assumption question, I will not automatically eliminate an answer choice just because it mentions something new, right? Things like that are things to, definite takeaways, things that we talked about tonight that you can identify in your work and practice to improve your score. Okay, last mention, like I said, we do have some great free options on our website. You can sign up for these free prep hours. You can take session 1 of any of our 10-session LSAT courses, in person or online. You can come attend session 1 for free and decide if you want to take the rest of the course or not. So those options are all available on our website, manhattanprep.com/LSAT. And if you go to /LSAT/resources, you can see some other free resources that we have available. But come check us out. Come to a course. Come to session 1 of one of our courses and see. We go into a lot more detail. You know, the class sessions are 3 hours. We can go into a lot more detail than we can go into in these free prep hours. And you get a really good feel for whether, you want to take one of our courses or not. But also in a 3-hour class session, that free trial class, you're going to get a lot of good information about how the LSAT works, and especially if you're starting out. Really, whether you're starting out or whether you've been practicing for a while, usually you can get something good out of that trial class and out of that free session. The first session, get some good information that's going to give you some good tips to help you increase your score. So that's it. That's all I got. Thanks a lot for being here. Thanks again. Come on out to another free prep hour sometime. Check out our website. Good luck with your LSAT prep, and come back and see us again sometime.